My daughter was embarrassed by me and decided I no longer fit into the future she was building. To her colleagues and powerful friends, I was just a caretaker with nothing to offer. When they mistook me for hired help and spoke down to me, she didn't correct them, not once. I didn't argue or defend myself. I simply stepped back and let them believe what they wanted. By the time she understood the truth, the damage was already done. What happened next changed all of our lives. I will tell you everything. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My daughter said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers if I share this story. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these stories matter and have the best audience. I appreciate your support. Now let's get to the details of what happened. The valet handed me a coat and said, "Staff entrance is around the back." I took it without correcting him, my fingers curling around the wool as if it belonged to someone else. And when I looked up, my daughter was already halfway across the marble lobby. She didn't turn around. She didn't pause. She didn't hear the way the word staff landed heavier than it should have. I followed the direction he pointed to, past a velvet rope and a mirrored wall that reflected a man I barely recognized. Gray at the temples, shoulders slightly stooped, dressed too neatly to be invisible and yet invisible all the same. I remember thinking, even then, that this moment would matter later, that the way she let it pass would eventually come back to her in a form neither of us could yet name. I had arrived early because that was my habit. Years of caretaking, both of land and of people, had trained me to show up before I was expected and leave after everyone else felt finished. The estate where I worked had taught me that rhythm, the quiet pride of being prepared without being seen. I parked where the staff parked, wore the same dark jacket I wore every day, and kept my head down as I entered the building that glittered with money and ambition. My daughter had told me the address and the time, nothing more, and I didn't ask questions. Asking questions had a way of making her tense lately, as if curiosity from me implied judgment. I told myself I was there to support her, not to complicate things. Even though a part of me already sensed that my presence itself was a complication she would rather manage than embrace. She was being celebrated that night. Another rung climbed, another title added to her name, and the room buzzed with the kind of confidence that came from people who believed they were finally becoming who they were always meant to be. I watched her from a distance as she laughed too loudly at a joke someone important made, her hand resting lightly on a champagne flute she hadn't touched. She looked polished, intentional, almost rehearsed, and I felt that familiar mix of pride and dislocation settle into my chest. I had known this version of her was coming. I had seen it years ago when she stopped bringing friends home and started meeting them elsewhere, when she began correcting my grammar mid-sentence, when she asked me, carefully, apologetically, to drop her off a block away from school. I didn't confront her then. I didn't confront her now. And that choice, I would come to understand, had its own cost. 2 days before the event, she had called me late in the evening, her voice clipped but cheerful, asking if I still had that old suit and whether I could make it look presentable. The question wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It assumed limitations without asking about them, assumed I was frozen in the same place she had worked so hard to escape. I told her yes, of course, and after we hung up, I stood in my bedroom holding the phone, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock that had belonged to her mother. Grief had taught me that silence could be both a refuge and a weapon. That night, I felt it leaning toward the latter, though I couldn't yet explain why. I had been a widower for 12 years by then, long enough for people to stop lowering their voices when they mentioned my wife, long enough for sympathy to be replaced with assumption. People assumed my life had stalled the day she died. That loss had flattened my ambition and left me content with small things. In truth, I had chosen small things because they were honest. After her death, I learned how little noise a meaningful life actually required. I learned that visibility was overrated, that control often lived in the background, that the loudest rooms rarely noticed who paid to keep the lights on. But these were lessons you couldn't pass on directly. You had to let people run into their opposites first. As I stood near the wall at the event, a server passed by and placed an empty glass in my hand without asking. "Table by the window needs clearing," she said, already moving on. I held the glass for a moment, feeling its chill seep into my palm, and then set it down on a tray nearby. I didn't correct her. I didn't look for my daughter. I told myself that dignity didn't require an audience. Even as a laugh rose from the group she was standing with, sharp and dismissive, followed by a whisper I couldn't quite catch. That was the moment something in me shifted, not into anger, but into clarity. I understood, with surprising calm, that my silence was being interpreted as consent. A text message buzzed in my pocket, pulling me briefly out of the room. It was from the grounds supervisor at the estate, letting me know the east fence repair had been completed under budget and ahead of schedule. I replied with a simple acknowledgement and slipped the phone away, the contrast between that quiet competence and the spectacle around me almost surreal. Here, people spoke in polished abstractions about value and impact. There, work was measured in things that stood and lasted. I wondered which world my daughter believed in now, and whether she realized how fragile the one she was chasing could be. I thought back to the years when she was in law school, exhausted and unsure, calling me late at night to talk through cases she didn't understand and fears she wouldn't admit to anyone else. I had listened more than I spoke, asked questions that helped her find her own answers, and when she received scholarships and fellowships, she credited merit and luck in equal measure. She never knew about the letters I wrote, the endowments quietly adjusted, the meetings I declined to attend in person. I didn't need her gratitude. I needed her confidence. Somewhere along the way, those two things became confused, and I suspected that confusion was about to surface in ways neither of us expected. As the evening wore on, introductions happened around me without me being included. That's one of the junior partners. That's a judge. That's someone you should know. No one said my name. When my daughter finally glanced my way, our eyes met for a brief second, and I saw something flicker there. Hesitation, calculation, maybe even shame. She smiled, small and tight, then turned back to her colleagues without waving me over. In that instant, I understood that she had made a choice, not just about how she saw me, but about who she needed me to be in order for her story to make sense. I left before dessert was served. No one noticed. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of rain, and the city hummed with its usual indifference. I stood on the steps for a moment, looking back at the building where my daughter was being applauded, and I felt a strange gratitude for the clarity the night had given me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt in the way people expect. I was resolved. I knew, then, that something would have to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. I walked to my car, already aware that the quiet I had chosen for so long was about to become something else entirely. I restructured some things legally, she said, stirring her coffee even though she hadn't added sugar, the spoon clinking against porcelain in a way that felt too loud for the quiet cafe. Just to simplify. She kept her eyes on the cup, not on me, and I noticed how carefully she'd chosen the place. Neutral, professional, somewhere she clearly felt in control. I nodded once, slowly, the way I did when tenants explained repairs they didn't quite understand or junior staff tried to sound confident about decisions already made. Even before she explained further, I sensed that this conversation wasn't about simplification at all. It was about distance. And, even then, I understood that whatever she had done on paper would eventually echo somewhere far louder. She spoke in the language of her profession, sentences smoothed of emotion, clauses stacked neatly like case law. She explained trusts, liability, future planning, and how it was all standard and nothing personal. The words landed between us like documents slid across a desk, meant to be read rather than felt. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded around my own cup, the heat seeping into my palms. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that she had learned to speak this way to protect herself, from uncertainty, from dependency, from the messy parts of being human. What she didn't realize was that the same armor that had helped her climb was now cutting into the people closest to her. As she continued, it became clear what she hadn't said outright. The restructuring excluded me from assets she assumed were minimal, symbolic at best. A caretaker's savings. A widower's modest holdings. Things that, in her mind, carried more sentiment than value. She framed it as efficiency, but beneath that was an unspoken assessment of my worth, not as a father, but as a factor in her upward trajectory. I wondered when she had last truly asked herself who I was beyond the role she had quietly minimized. I wondered when ambition had taught her that simplification sometimes meant erasure. A message buzzed on my phone mid-conversation, a brief interruption she didn't notice because she was too focused on her explanation. It was from the accountant who managed several properties, confirming quarterly figures and asking how I wanted to allocate surplus funds this year. I didn't open it fully. I didn't want the glow of the screen to pull me out of the moment or to betray anything I wasn't ready to confront. Instead, I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned my attention to my daughter, who was now talking about risk exposure and optics, words that told me more about her fear than she likely intended. I thought about the years after her mother died, when money had been the last thing on my mind. Back then, my priority had been stability, emotional first, practical second. I had chosen quiet stewardship over visible ownership, believing that consistency mattered more than recognition. I had believed that shielding her from certain truths would give her room to grow without pressure. Sitting across from her now, I questioned that choice for the first time. Not with regret exactly, but with a growing awareness that protection, taken too far, can distort reality. She wasn't just ignorant of my life. She had rewritten it to fit her narrative. She paused eventually, as if expecting reassurance, perhaps even gratitude. I gave her neither. I told her I understood, that if this made her feel secure, she should proceed as she saw fit. My voice was calm, steady, the same voice I used when making decisions that couldn't be undone. She relaxed visibly at that, mistaking my composure for agreement. That misunderstanding settled between us, heavy and unresolved. I knew then that she believed she was protecting herself from being dragged backward. What she couldn't see was that she had already stepped onto ground that wouldn't hold. 2 days later, a formal email arrived from her firm's legal department, copied to me as a courtesy, outlining the completed changes. The language was pristine, impersonal, almost elegant in its finality. I read it slowly, noting the assumptions baked into every clause. There was no malice there, only certainty, the kind that comes from believing you fully understand the terrain beneath your feet. I forwarded the email to my attorney with a brief note. Acknowledged. Nothing more. No objections. No clarifications. Silence, I had learned, was often interpreted as consent, and consent, in the right context, could be leveraged. That evening, as I walked the grounds of the estate, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes, I thought about ambition and how easily it confuses motion with progress. The property was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists where things are well maintained and deeply rooted. Lights glowed warmly in windows, lives unfolding inside without any awareness of the structures, legal, financial, human, that made that peace possible. I had spent decades ensuring that kind of stability for others, rarely asking what it cost me in terms of being known. Watching my daughter rise, I had assumed she understood that quiet didn't mean empty. I was beginning to see how wrong that assumption had been. Another interruption came later that night, a call from a colleague who served on the board of an educational foundation I supported. He thanked me for my continued generosity and mentioned, almost in passing, how impressive my daughter's ascent had been, how proud I must be. I told him I was, because that part was still true. Pride doesn't vanish just because disappointment takes root beside it. But after the call ended, I sat alone in the darkened living room and let the weight of the day settle. I realized that the support she took for granted was invisible by design, and that invisibility had consequences. By the end of that week, I had made a quiet decision. Not a punishment, not retaliation, but a recalibration. I would let the structures she trusted operate exactly as she believed they did. I would step back, allow the systems to respond to her choices without my interference smoothing the edges. This wasn't anger speaking. It was clarity. I understood that growth sometimes requires the removal of scaffolding, even when the fall is uncomfortable. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn her. And that delay, that choice to let things unfold naturally, would soon set forces in motion neither of us could stop. At her promotion celebration, someone pressed an empty glass into my hand and nodded toward the far table, saying, "If you could clear that when you're done, we're running behind." I didn't answer. I didn't correct him. I simply took the glass, feeling the faint residue of lipstick on the rim, and turned toward the table he'd indicated. The room hummed with congratulatory noise, and somewhere behind me my daughter laughed, a bright, practiced sound that cut through the music. In that moment, as I set the glass down and straightened, I understood with startling certainty that this was no longer just misunderstanding. It was a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, demanded a response. By that weekend, the memory of the cafe conversation had hardened into something sharper. I replayed her tone, the careful neutrality, the way she had framed exclusion as efficiency. I realized then that she hadn't acted impulsively. She had prepared. She had anticipated outcomes, weighed optics, and decided that my presence, my history, introduced variables she didn't want attached to her assent. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal often does. It clarified. I saw my role in her life as she currently understood it, a liability to be minimized, a past to be managed discreetly. The understanding settled in my chest, not as resentment, but as a sober assessment of where things stood. 2 days later, I received a printed invitation in the mail, thick cardstock, embossed lettering, thanking me for attending the celebration and inviting me to future firm events as staff availability permitted. I read the line twice, my name typed neatly above it, and felt a quiet amusement flicker through me. The assumption was complete now, institutionalized even. I placed the card on the kitchen counter beside an envelope from the bank and a handwritten note from a groundskeeper thanking me for approving his daughter's internship. The contrast felt almost deliberate, as if the universe were arranging evidence for a lesson I was finally ready to learn. I spent the next morning walking the estate, as I often did, noting small details most people overlooked. The way the hedges had grown uneven near the south wall, the faint crack in the stone path that would need attention before winter. A tenant stopped me to ask about a leaking faucet, apologizing for bothering me so early. I reassured him, made a note, and watched relief soften his shoulders. These interactions grounded me. They reminded me that respect didn't require spectacle, only consistency. Somewhere between the trimmed hedges and the quiet lake at the edge of the property, I acknowledged something I had resisted for years. My silence had not been neutral. It had been instructive, teaching others how to treat me. A text message arrived while I stood by the water, this one from my daughter. "Did you enjoy the event? Sorry I didn't get much time to talk." The apology was light, almost procedural, and I could sense the calculation beneath it. Enough acknowledgement to seem considerate, not enough to invite a deeper conversation. I replied with a simple yes. "Congratulations." I watched the message send and disappear, aware that even this restraint was a choice. I was no longer reacting. I was deciding when and how to engage, and that shift carried a weight I hadn't anticipated. Later that week, an email chain crossed my desk regarding an upcoming fellowship program at her firm, one I had quietly funded for years. The tone was celebratory, optimistic, full of plans and projections. I read it carefully, noting how my name never appeared, how the support was treated as an abstract constant rather than a decision renewed annually. That omission mattered more than I expected. It revealed an assumption not unlike my daughter's, that what had always been there would remain, regardless of how it was treated. I closed the email without responding, aware that my lack of immediate engagement would be read as busyness, not withdrawal. That misunderstanding bought me time. As days passed, I began redirecting small things first. A donation postponed. A meeting declined. A check reduced slightly, framed as a temporary adjustment. Each change was subtle enough to avoid alarm, but together they formed a shift in current, a quiet redirection of resources toward places where gratitude still traveled in both directions. I told myself this wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about alignment. Support, I had learned, should flow where values were shared, not merely where success was visible. Even so, I couldn't ignore the sense that I was crossing a threshold, moving from passive endurance into deliberate action. One evening, as I reviewed property reports at my desk, the phone rang. It was a colleague from an academic board, his voice unusually tense. He mentioned delays, budget questions, uncertainties that hadn't existed months before. He asked, carefully, whether everything was all right on my end. I assured him it was, keeping my tone neutral, and suggested we revisit allocations at the next quarterly meeting. When the call ended, I sat back and considered how quickly stability could feel fragile once the scaffolding was questioned. This, I realized, was how systems revealed their dependencies, not through collapse, but through unease. I thought often of my daughter during that period, imagining her navigating meetings and deadlines, unaware of the subtle shifts happening beneath her professional footing. Part of me wanted to warn her, to step in as I always had and smooth the path ahead. But another part, quieter and firmer, understood that intervention now would only reinforce the very assumptions that had led us here. Growth required friction. Understanding required consequence. I didn't know how far things would go, only that they had already begun moving. And once motion started, stopping it prematurely would only distort the lesson. By the end of the month, the realization that had been forming finally settled into place. Silence, I understood, wasn't absence. It was leverage. Used carefully, it allowed truths to surface without confrontation, let people encounter the results of their choices without explanation. I hadn't raised my voice or made demands. I had simply withdrawn the invisible threads that held things together. As I closed my ledger that night, the house quiet around me, I felt neither triumph nor regret. Only a steady awareness that the path ahead would reveal more than any conversation ever could. "They froze the fellowship," she said over the phone, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since she was younger and afraid to admit she didn't have control. No explanation, just postponed. I stood in my kitchen with the receiver pressed to my ear, watching steam rise from a kettle I'd forgotten to turn off, and listened as she filled the silence with speculation, budget reviews, shifting priorities, internal politics. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt or reassure her. Even then, I understood that this call was not really about the fellowship. It was about the first tremor beneath a ladder she had trusted without question, and somewhere beneath her frustration was the fear that it might not be as stable as she'd believed. Over the next 2 weeks, those tremors multiplied. She called again to tell me a project she had led was being reassigned temporarily. Then again when a promised introduction to a senior judge was quietly canceled. Each time, her explanations grew longer, more frantic, as if piling words on top of uncertainty could keep it from spreading. I listened with the same steady attention I had always given her, but something fundamental had changed. I no longer felt responsible for absorbing her anxiety or correcting her course. I was witnessing, not managing. And with every call, I sensed her confidence thinning, stretched between the image she projected and the reality she was beginning to encounter. A letter arrived from her firm around that time, addressed to me formally, thanking me for my continued historical support and informing me of an upcoming review cycle. The phrasing was careful, almost cautious, as if someone somewhere had noticed the absence of my usual affirmations. I placed the letter on my desk beside a stack of reports from organizations I'd recently chosen to support instead. Community programs, scholarships without prestige attached, mentorship initiatives that valued patience over polish. Redirecting those resources felt less like withdrawal and more like correction, an alignment with the values I had lived by quietly for years. Still, I couldn't deny the sense of inevitability building alongside those decisions. When my daughter visited me that weekend, she carried herself differently. The sharp certainty that once framed her posture had softened into something restless. She paced my living room while she talked, gesturing with hands that used to be precise, now searching for emphasis that wouldn't quite land. She asked whether I knew anyone who might offer insight, whether I'd heard rumors, whether I thought she should be worried. I answered honestly but narrowly, telling her that institutions changed priorities all the time and that careers rarely moved in straight lines. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't make calls. And as I watched her absorb my restraint, I realized how accustomed she had been to invisible cushions she'd never acknowledged. A small but telling moment came when she noticed the absence of a familiar envelope on my counter, the quarterly statement she'd once glanced at dismissively. "Did you stop investing?" she asked, attempting casualness. I told her I'd shifted some focus, that I was supporting different initiatives now. She nodded, but her eyes lingered, calculating, as if trying to place that information within a framework that was suddenly missing key pieces. It struck me then how rarely she had considered my choices independent of their utility to her. That realization didn't harden me. It saddened me, quietly, like discovering a room in your home had been slowly emptied without your noticing. As autumn deepened, the fallout became harder for her to rationalize away. A promotion she had expected by year's end was deferred indefinitely. Invitations to exclusive events slowed, then stopped. She spoke of colleagues distancing themselves, of conversations that ended too quickly, of opportunities that evaporated without explanation. Each update carried the same underlying question she never voiced directly. Why is this happening now? I could hear the strain in her voice, the beginning of doubt not just in the system, but in herself. And still, I remained silent about my role, understanding that premature revelation would turn consequence into accusation rather than understanding. One evening, after she left, I received a call from a board member I'd known for decades. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the same caution one uses when stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He asked whether my recent reallocations were permanent, whether there was something the institution should address. I told him the truth, that my priorities had evolved and that I believed support should follow values as much as outcomes. He thanked me for my candor, though I could hear the unease beneath it. When the call ended, I sat in the dim light of my study and considered how quickly certainty dissolved once its foundations were questioned. This was not collapse yet. It was exposure. I thought often of my late wife during those nights, of the way she had understood restraint not as weakness, but as respect for others' capacity to grow. She had believed that shielding someone from consequence robbed them of clarity. Remembering her steadied me. It reminded me that love did not always look like rescue. Sometimes it looked like patience in the face of discomfort, trust in the long arc of understanding. I wondered what she would think of our daughter now. Brilliant, driven, and finally confronting the limits of ambition untempered by humility. By the time winter approached, the shifts were undeniable. Funding gaps became agenda items. Reviews became audits. My daughter stopped calling as frequently, perhaps sensing that I no longer held the answers she wanted. When she did reach out, her tone was subdued, cautious, as if she were afraid of saying the wrong thing. I recognized that fear. It was the same one I'd felt years earlier, standing in a hospital hallway with news I couldn't change. But unlike then, this was not a moment for comfort alone. It was a moment for reckoning. I knew the truth would surface eventually, that institutions built on quiet patronage had a way of revealing their dependencies when pressed. I didn't know when or how, only that the distance between cause and effect was narrowing. As I reviewed my calendar one evening and noted an upcoming board meeting I had agreed to attend in person for the first time in years, I felt the weight of what was coming settle fully into place. The ladder she had climbed was shaking now, not because it was unfairly built, but because she had never looked down to see who held it steady. "Before we proceed," the chair said, tapping the microphone with a practiced smile, "we'd like to formally acknowledge our principal benefactor, whose support has shaped this institution for more than a decade." I was seated near the end of the table, hands folded, posture relaxed in a way that only comes when you've already accepted what's about to happen. The room was full, partners, judges, donors, rising stars. And my daughter sat 3 seats from the front, her back straight, pen poised, ready to prove she belonged there. When my name was spoken, clearly and without embellishment, the silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition arriving late. I stood slowly, aware of how every movement seemed amplified in that moment. Chairs shifted. Someone cleared their throat. I felt eyes tracking me, recalibrating, matching memory to new information. The chair continued, outlining contributions, endowments, properties, influence. All the things that had existed quietly while credit flowed elsewhere. As he spoke, I watched my daughter's composure fracture in stages. First disbelief, then calculation, then something like grief. She turned to look at me fully for the first time in months, and in her expression I saw the collapse of a story she had told herself for years, that I was simple, peripheral, safely irrelevant. The irony was not lost on me. This room, built on prestige and assumption, was now forced to confront how thoroughly it had misjudged the man it had ignored. I had walked these halls unnoticed, mistaken for staff, thanked vaguely, dismissed casually. And now, without raising my voice or asserting my presence, I was suddenly unavoidable. The recognition was not triumphant. It was awkward, corrective, laced with the discomfort of people realizing how much they had revealed about themselves through their indifference. I remained standing only long enough to acknowledge the introduction, nodding once before taking my seat again. Whispers spread quickly, low and urgent. I caught fragments. That's her father. How did we not know? He owns the estate. Each one a small confession of oversight. My daughter didn't whisper. She didn't speak at all. She stared ahead, jaw tight, hands still, as if movement might fracture whatever remained intact. I recognized that stillness. It was the same one she had worn as a child when she realized she was wrong, but wasn't ready to admit it. Except this time, the audience was larger, and the stakes were public. The meeting proceeded, but its tone had shifted irreversibly. Discussions about funding and restructuring now carried an undercurrent of apology, of careful phrasing meant to avoid further offense. Proposals were reframed, decisions deferred. I listened without comment, aware that my silence now carried a different weight than it ever had before. It was no longer invisible. It was scrutinized, interpreted, feared. I didn't correct misconceptions or clarify timelines. I let the room sit with its realization, understanding that discomfort was part of the reckoning. During a brief recess, my daughter stood abruptly and stepped into the hallway. I followed a moment later, not to confront her, but because distance felt unnecessary now. She turned when she heard my footsteps, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. There were no accusations in her eyes, only devastation. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked finally, her voice breaking on the last word. The question wasn't defensive. It was wounded. I answered honestly, telling her I had believed she wanted space, independence, a life unshadowed by my choices. The truth landed heavily between us, neither absolving nor condemning. She tried to speak again, but a call from inside the room interrupted us. Business resumed. She returned to her seat, visibly altered, while I took mine with the same calm I had carried in. When the meeting ended, people approached me with newfound respect, apologies thinly veiled as compliments. I accepted them politely, without warmth or resentment. This wasn't about vindication. It was about clarity. The truth, once revealed, didn't need embellishment. It stood on its own, reshaping relationships without a word. Outside, the afternoon light felt harsher than it had that morning. My daughter caught up to me on the steps, tears finally spilling over as the performance of control collapsed. She apologized, haltingly at first, then in a rush, naming her shame, her assumptions, her fear of being diminished by association. I listened, really listened, because this was the first time she had spoken to me without armor. I forgave her internally in that moment, not because forgiveness erased harm, but because carrying anger would have distorted what needed to happen next. What I did not do was promise restoration. I did not offer to step back into the shadows so she could regain her footing unchanged. I told her, gently but firmly, that love did not require invisibility, and support did not survive being taken for granted. I explained that my choices going forward would reflect where humility and respect lived, not where status demanded them. She nodded through tears, understanding enough to know she couldn't argue, not yet ready to accept the permanence of what had shifted. As I drove home, the city passing by in familiar patterns, I felt a quiet finality settle over me. The truth had emerged not as a weapon, but as a mirror. What my daughter did with that reflection would be her work alone. I had done mine, not by confronting her in anger, but by allowing reality to speak when words would have failed. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was complete. She stood in my doorway long after sunset, her coat still on, eyes red and unfocused, holding herself the way people do when they're afraid that if they move too much, something inside them will finally break. She said my name the way she used to when she was small, soft, uncertain, reaching, and for a moment the past pressed in so hard I had to steady myself against the doorframe. I let her in without a word. The house felt different with her there, as if it remembered her even when she no longer knew how to belong to it. I knew before she spoke that this visit was inevitable, and I also knew that whatever happened next would be the last version of us that ever existed. She apologized immediately, as if silence might swallow her courage if she waited too long. The words came out unevenly, tangled with sobs and self-reproach, and she didn't try to justify herself this time. She spoke about the meeting, about the looks she couldn't escape afterward, about how every achievement she'd built suddenly felt fraudulent. She told me she hadn't slept, that she kept replaying moments she wished she could undo. The lobby, the laughter, the way she let others misname me without correction. I listened from the armchair across from her, hands folded, heart heavy but strangely calm. I had imagined this conversation before, but the reality was quieter than I'd expected, stripped of drama by the weight of truth. When she finally stopped talking, the room filled with a silence that felt earned rather than empty. I told her I forgave her, not as a performance, not as leverage, but as an internal choice I had already made. I explained that forgiveness was not the same as reversal, that understanding didn't rewind time or restore what had been diminished. I could see the hope flicker in her eyes when I said the word forgive, and I watched it falter as she realized what I wasn't offering. This was not a reunion scene. It was a reckoning, and she was only just beginning to understand the difference. She asked if we could start over, if I could help her rebuild what she'd lost, if things could go back to how they were before she made mistakes. That phrasing, mistakes, hung between us, heavy with implication. I chose my words carefully then, not to soften them, but to make them honest. I told her that what had happened wasn't a single misstep, but a pattern of choices rooted in fear and pride. I told her that support given invisibly had taught her the wrong lesson about value, and that restoring it now would only repeat that harm. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The finality lived in the clarity. She cried harder then, grief folding in on itself as she confronted a loss that wasn't just professional, but personal. I felt that grief too, though mine was quieter, older, shaped by years of watching distance grow where closeness once lived. I told her I loved her, because that was still true and always would be. But love, I explained, did not require proximity, nor did it survive being hidden to preserve an image. I had spent too long shrinking to make her ascent easier. I would not do it again. The boundary was not punishment. It was preservation of myself, of my values, of the life I had chosen deliberately. We talked late into the night, not arguing, not negotiating, but naming things that had never been said aloud. She admitted she had been afraid that acknowledging me fully would tether her to a version of herself she was desperate to outgrow. I admitted that I had mistaken her distance for independence rather than shame. Neither confession fixed anything, but they clarified the ground beneath us, and sometimes that is all understanding can do. When she finally stood to leave, she looked smaller somehow, not diminished, but stripped of pretense. I walked her to the door and hugged her once, tightly, knowing it would be a long time before we stood that close again. After she left, the house returned to its familiar quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that only comes when something unresolved has finally settled into truth. In the weeks that followed, I redirected my time with the same intention I'd once applied to my resources. I mentored younger caretakers, funded programs without prestige, and spent mornings walking the land I had always loved without needing to explain why. People who valued humility found their way to me, and I found satisfaction in being fully seen by those who didn't need me to be anything else. I heard about my daughter from a distance, career setbacks, reputational damage, the slow work of rebuilding trust without shortcuts. I didn't interfere. I didn't comment. My silence now was not withdrawal. It was respect for her process. She had to learn who she was without invisible scaffolding, just as I had learned who I was without applause. If she grew from this, it would be because she chose to, not because I softened the ground beneath her feet again. That distinction mattered more than comfort. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I thought about what might have been different if I had spoken sooner, asserted myself louder, corrected assumptions in real time. But those thoughts never lingered. The truth was that she hadn't needed a louder father. She had needed a truer one. And truth, I had learned, doesn't chase recognition. It waits. It allows people to reveal themselves. And when it finally speaks, it does so without anger, without explanation, and without apology. I continued living quietly, not retreating, not hiding, simply choosing where my presence belonged. My daughter and I spoke occasionally after that, carefully, honestly, without expectation. There was no reconciliation arc, no restoration of what had been lost. There was only a new shape to our relationship, defined by distance and respect rather than obligation and denial. I accepted that shape without resentment. Some lessons don't end in closeness. They end in clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand acknowledgement. I didn't punish her. I simply stopped being invisible and allowed the silence that followed to do what words never could. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, like, subscribe, and share, because sometimes the quietest boundaries are the ones that change everything. See you soon in the next story.